And it is my distinct honor and pleasure to once again welcome back into the studios for a conversation on race relations in America, Montana, and Bozeman. Mr. Shane Doyle has been a guest in the past. How have you been, friend?
Hey, pretty good. Thank you for having me this morning, Chris.
You're very welcome because you are a much more learned man than I am.
Oh, I don't know.
You hold multiple degrees. You hold advanced degrees.
Yeah, I guess in Bozeman that means something.
Well, it means something to me because I don't hold a degree. I just ask the questions. And I guess the question to ask right from the very beginning is, what is the status of race relations between Native Americans in Montana?
Well, I think it's, a tough thing to answer, Chris, clearly. I think there's a lot of different perspectives on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would, I'd have to speak to what context you're referring to. But overall, I would say, it's hard to say that they're getting better. But I think they probably are.
How does racism manifest itself between Native Americans and whites specifically, or Native Americans and other races?
Well, that's another great question. I think when you talk about racism, it's a loaded term, and I think that you're so used to hearing that term reference to African Americans and the dominant society, and so you can think of a lot of different, I guess, media productions, artistic productions, but also moments in our recent American history, recent as in 2 weeks ago, or as in yesterday, or 1964, where racism manifests itself within the context of African American and white Americans somewhere in America, where we have obviously higher populations than we do in Montana. Of both of those, I don't want to use the term race because, again, one of the things that I was learned, was taught in college, is race is not really a reality. We have phenotypes, we have people who look very much the same, skin color is the same, but the whole thing about race is a packaged notion. So I would say that when we look at it from a larger perspective in America, it's really difficult to try and compare the Native American experience to the Black experience. And I know it's the most obvious thing that you want to do, is just to say, well, how do these two things match up and how do these two things compare? And for me, as an American Indian person coming from Montana, it's difficult to answer that because, honestly, I don't know. I can't get into the head of racist white people. I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know what perspective they're coming from. Is it because Indians, is it a cultural thing? Or is it a skin color thing? And like you say, where does it manifest itself? Well, it manifests itself all over the place. If you're an American Indian, and you have the long hair and the dark skin, and you have a big family, and you're trying to rent a house here in Bozeman, it might manifest itself then, because people might have packaged notions of what you're going to bring to their apartment, large family gatherings, out of control children, just all kinds of stereotypes that come along with, I think, American Indian culture, based on the guy's skin color, on if he has long hair, braid, or the woman, whether or not she has the different cultural traits that you look for in someone who is, upfront and outgoing, or is she kind of more quiet and maybe what would be considered withdrawn? Then maybe that racism will manifest itself in that respect, and that they might, whoever's renting that house might decide that this woman is either untrustworthy or someone who they'd rather not, rent to because of the potential for who knows what could happen. She's an Indian. There's always drinking going on in Indian families, that type of a preconceived notion. But what if you're an Indian and you come in and you don't look like you're Indian? No one could tell walking down the street that, you're from the reservation or that you're enrolled or whatever. Then what kind of racism do you experience? You know what I mean? So your question is difficult. It's a complex question, Chris, and it needs to be considered within the context of each instance.
And, thank you for bringing up the complexity of it, because it is a complex question that I tried to boil it down to a very simple question, but it brings up all those facets.
But that's what we do in America, though, and that's part of the problem.
Well, which leads me to my next question is, one of the mythologies that I've come across doing research in this is there's a kernel of truth to every stereotype.
That's right.
Do you believe that?
Absolutely.
There is a kernel of truth?
Absolutely.
It's exaggerated to gargantuan proportions.
Mm-hmm.
How do we break down those stereotypes in an attempt to ultimately gain a better understanding of different races?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. American Indians are probably the most misunderstood people in the world.
Yeah, well, because you're all alcoholics.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the stereotypes.
Yeah.
And alcoholism on the reservation in Native American culture is a stereotype, but there is that kernel of truth.
Well, it's true. It is a lot of alcoholism, and it's debilitating. Yeah.
Is it from what I've come to learn through researching these topics is it's not necessarily because of being a Native American. It's a much more of a socioeconomic issue.
Well, again, it's a complex issue that's unique to Native Americans in so many ways, and American Indians of the High Plains, of the Great West, the Great Plains. We're the ones you think of typically who are the alcoholics. I mean, even though you could say from Alaska to the Seminoles in Florida that you see alcoholism, but when you think of it, you think of typical Indians and their issues and problems and whatnot. You think of the Western tribes, and again, I think we're some of the most misunderstood people in the world, Chris. And one of the reasons for that is because we're an oral tradition. And so we didn't have, our historians, our cultural anthropologists, our literary folks writing all this stuff down for white people to look over in libraries and comb through and analyze and set up classes on. And you can't do that with our culture. You can't analyze it from that perspective because we didn't write things down here on the Great Plains. And so, a lot of people thought they had a pretty good understanding of what Indians were here in Montana and on the Great Plains. And you can go back to the killing of John Bozeman here in Bozeman, and how the Blackfeet, got the blame for that. If you go back and you read the papers during the 1860s and 70s, and even, earlier than that, there was very little interaction, violent interaction between Blackfeet Indians and non-Indians anywhere in Montana. I mean, in the early part of the 19th century, when the forts got set up out here at Three Forks, there was violence, and the Blackfeet, had some violent encounters with some fur trappers, but they gave them a heads-up warning too. And we're like, hey, if you guys come in here and trap beavers, we're going to chase you out of here. Of course, those warnings weren't heeded, and that was part of the John Coulter run. And so, this misunderstanding of the Blackfeet people, anyone who's ever spent time with the Blackfeet people understands first and foremost that they're a family-oriented people, like all of us on the Great Plains. We're very much family-centered people, and we're misunderstood as being these violent, marauders, and I'm talking about not just the Blackfeet, but you could go on and on, Cheyennes, the Sioux, not so much the Crows get thrown in that boat, but we are included in there as far as Plains Indians goes. And but just misunderstood, Chris, because like I said, there's so very little interaction and knowledge out there about us, and it's continued up to this day. And to me, look, as a historian, as someone who works in academia and kind of looks at it from these different perspectives, we've always been misunderstood. We're family-oriented, ceremonial people, and we were, made out to be much worse than we actually were in terms of violence. But if you think about our history of violence against America, period, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after the Indian Wars were over, find another place in the world where colonized people didn't continue to have violent outbursts. Here in America, it never happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, we didn't, hold up any stagecoaches. We didn't burn any saloons down. We didn't take over any hostages in any hotels. It wasn't the way Indian people operated. And that's misunderstood as well. And then how do we, entered right into the U.S. military, seemingly in one seamless motion from being bitter enemies of the U.S. government to all of a sudden throwing on their uniform and grabbing a gun and getting shipped off to France and Germany and without even being citizens. I mean, for non-Indians, I think, to understand and fully grasp where we're coming from as individuals, you have to consider all those different phenomenons, and that's a steep thing.
It is 1450 KMMS, 1340 KPRK. Mr. Shane Doyle has been a guest in the past discussing race relations from a Native American perspective. Shane, as you've made mention now at least twice in my notes here, that the Native American culture is an oral culture, and we don't have papers to sift through in museums to read the story. How do we break down those divisions? Is it just best to have conversation?
Oh, that's it. You're very very insightful, and that's the next step, right? Well, where do we go from here? How do we make things better? How do we understand each other better? And it's hard to do that without spending time with one another. And that's part of the reason, why I said at the beginning of this interview that I'm not sure that race relations are actually getting better in Montana, because I'm not sure that we're actually interacting with each other more than we used to. And, there's many reasons for that. But you're right, Chris. I think just talking with each other, just getting to know each other as individuals, as human beings, I think that's when stereotypes get broken down, and we can recognize the humanity in each other.
It sounds so simple. I mean,
doesn't
it? Just have a conversation.
It's like get along with your wife, right?
Yeah, happy wife, happy life.
That's exactly right.
But it really is that simple. Just start a conversation with someone whose skin color may not be yours.
And you know where it starts even before that, Chris, is with yourself, right? I mean, we have to look inwards first before we start to try and build bridges to outwards.
Well, Shane, we're just about out of time. I have like 10 seconds left. This conversation could go on for much, much longer, but I appreciate you spending some time with myself and my listeners today, and thank you for your insight.
Thank you very much. Appreciate